A Bell County jury found Caysen Allison guilty of criminally negligent homicide nearly 3 years after the deadly stabbing at Belton High. Allison was charged with murder for the death of Joe Ramirez in 2022. After weeks of testimony and evidence and over 12 hours of deliberations, including being sequestered overnight, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty of criminally negligent homicide. Allison's defense attorney, Zachary Boyd, spoke moments after the verdict was delivered.
All right, folks, let's talk about this verdict. You heard it. After the jury listened to everything, after they waded through the mud and the murky waters churned up by a less than perfect investigation, they came back with criminally negligent homicide. Now the state, they started out hard swinging and crying murder. They wanted everyone to believe that my client, this young man, Caysen Allison, was a cold-blooded murderer. But that's not the verdict you heard today. The jury looked at the evidence. They looked at all of the evidence, or rather, they looked at the lack of all of the evidence. The vital pieces that were ignored or mishandled, and they said no, not murder. They didn't even say manslaughter, which is a step down and requires recklessness or a conscious disregard of risk. No, they found criminally negligent homicide. Now, what does that mean under Texas law? It means that Caysen caused the death, but it was by criminal negligence. It's about failing to perceive a substantial and unjustifiable risk that his actions would cause the death. It's a gross deviation from what an ordinary person should have been aware. Think about that. It means the jury found he did not intend to kill, or even that he was aware of the specific risk, but decided to ignore it. They found he should have been aware, based on his actions in a moment of sheer terror and chaos. This verdict, while it is not the full acquittal that we were seeking, is a clear rejection of the state's case and the state's primary narrative. It tells us that the jury grappled with the context of what happened in that bathroom that day on May 3rd of 2022. They heard about the after-prom party where someone from Joe's group pulled a gun on Caysen. They heard Sam Ramirez testify despite his own fear about witnessing that gun being brandished. They heard from Corbin Ovale tell you about Joe Ramirez's history of violence and his group and their history of jumping people. They heard Angel Murillo say Caysen didn't want to fight and Joe tried to lock the bathroom door. Tito Chamel was the cameraman. He confirmed that Joe tried to lock the door and initiated the encounter. He also said that he was recording the fight because Joe liked to have his fights recorded. They saw Caysen's injuries from the attack consistent with being sucker punched. They heard Caysen's own words from the interview that he was rushed and punched after they took off their backpacks and approached him. And all of this evidence, the evidence the state often tried to ignore or minimize or mislead the jury on, painted a picture of a young man facing a perceived threat of serious bodily injury or death who was trapped in a small, confined, inescapable place, a boys' bathroom. And we all know that nothing good ever happens in the boys' bathroom. Self-defense under the law the judge gave allowed for the deadly use of force if he reasonably believed it was immediately necessary to protect himself. There was no self-defense option in regards to criminally negligent homicide. The jury had to consider whether or not the state proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Caysen did not act in self-defense, and they wholly failed to do so. And let's not forget the shadow cast by the investigation itself. The failure to Mirandize Caysen at the arrest, the minimization of Caysen Allison's rights under Miranda at the beginning of his interrogation, watching with callous disregard as Caysen's injuries continue to hurt him. He continues to feel worse throughout the interview, such that at one point he lays down on the floor and vomits. And the quote you hear from the law enforcement officer, Detective Gatewood, at that time is, "You weren't kidding, were you, Caysen?" Because Caysen was telling the truth in that interview as best as he knew it, after having sustained a closed head injury that was diagnosed at the ER when they had to rule out a brain bleed by CT to make sure he wasn't more injured than he actually was. These were not minor hiccups. They didn't even try to investigate self-defense. They didn't even try to put together a day-in-the-life video of each of the boys that day when they arrived at school, when they went to their first period class, when they left their first period class and walked to the bathroom at A100 in that wing where these events took place, and then when they left. Because it was too much footage, I guess. We had 18 plus terabytes of video. They said, law enforcement said they looked at less than an hour of video. They simply chose not to do a complete, thorough, and comprehensive investigation. The jury, by returning a verdict of criminally negligent homicide, has told us they didn't buy the state's argument that Caysen acted with intent to kill or even act with reckless disregard for life in that moment. They saw a young man scared, injured, reacting in a sudden, violent encounter that others initiated and escalated. This verdict reflects a finding of a lower level of culpability, recognizing the chaos and fear Caysen experienced, which may have prevented him from fully perceiving the risk in that split second, even if an ordinary person hypothetically should have. This is not over. We move on to the sentencing phase. We will continue to fight for justice for Caysen Allison, a young man who was trying to graduate, trying to avoid trouble. He was thrust into a terrifying situation, and this verdict acknowledges that what happened was a tragedy, and it rejects the state's attempt to paint Caysen as a murderer. It brings us closer to the truth, a truth based on layers, a truth rooted in self-preservation in the face of fear and attack. Thank you. Are there any questions?
What are the possibilities for the sentencing hearing as far as?
Well, the range of punishment for a state jail felony is from 6 months to 2 years, day for day, in the state jail, and a possible fine of up to $10,000. That's all, of course, up to the judge to determine.
And currently, I know he's under his bond conditions, so what exactly, can you clarify what that is?
He's just got to keep doing what he's been doing for the last 3 years. He's been on bond conditions for 3 years. He hasn't so much as had one single hiccup.
If you could say one thing to Belton PD in terms of investigating and making sure that things like this don't slip through the cracks, what would you say?
It's not my job to tell law enforcement how to do their job. I would say everyone wakes up, everyone tries to do the best job they can do every single day, and that's the best we can hope for. Hopefully they'll remove the blinders in future investigations, and hopefully when I ask them to look in things at a crime scene, they'll start looking into things at a crime scene, give me the videos that I ask for, and look at the locks real time to determine if they work or not. Because likely, when I do that as early on as a crime scene, I'm probably going to come back to it at some point during trial.
Kind of along the lines of police, I know that you can see right now there's like a huge police presence along this case. I know
This case has been accompanied with threats against Caysen Allison, against Caysen Allison's family, against the defense team. You felt that tension in the courtroom. We have continually requested people to keep an eye out, people to investigate, and I'm just thankful that the Bell County Sheriff's Office has taken it so seriously and taken everyone's safety seriously. Caysen's family, the juries, and then me and my wife's.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of along the lines of Caysen and his family, have you heard from them? What's kind of been their reaction to this verdict?
We're ecstatic in some ways, but it wasn't the complete verdict we were looking for. So we move forward and we continue to seek justice, and we continue to have a just outcome at the sentencing phase.
And after, I spoke with a little bit of Caysen's family, and they told me yesterday, that no matter what happens, it's going to be a tragedy on both sides. So what would you say, to the Ramirez family? They're not happy about this, but what would you say to them?
This was a hard case, and nobody should ever outlive their child. No human being should have their child die in a violent way. And I'm so sorry for their loss. And the Allison family is so sorry for their loss, because there is no good outcome to this. There is no happy ending in terms of everyone's going to leave here feeling happy. The world is not black and white. The world is shades of gray. And ultimately, we were left with the question of, what do you do when the issue is one of bullying or one of a child who is so scared that he brings a knife to school to defend himself with? And those 12 jurors had to answer that question, ultimately. And we've got the answer to the question today. You cannot tolerate bullying, and there are bad things that can happen that are unintended consequences. That's really all I've got, and I don't think words are enough. I don't think words are enough.
I have one last question. In regards to other cases around the state of Texas involving younger students in stabbings, we had one recently, there's one in Frisco. Do you think this case and this verdict will impact the way people view it?
I don't know. I think every single case has its own set of facts. Every single case is its own story, has its own cast of characters, and every single case has to be presented to a jury in a way a jury can digest it. So depending on those facts, depending on those casts of characters, is going to depend on whether or not self-defense is applicable or not. It's going to depend on the investigation that law enforcement does or chooses to do. And all we can do is provide a blue sky, right? And give the jury everything so that they can make a decision based on the facts and based on the law. Because we absolutely have the greatest system of justice in the entire world.